Roger, welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. Pleasure to have you on. Fantastic conversation is ahead of us, so thank you for taking some time out to speak to me and my audience.
Ben, thank you. What a delight to be finally having this conversation. We've had so many sort of friends and strands of topical interest in common. I'm really looking forward to this. Thanks very much for having me.
So, look, this is the first time that we've had you on the show, and so a good chunk of my audience perhaps is unfamiliar with you and your work, and therefore it would be great if you could just start with painting a picture of who you are and what you do.
Sure, one of the nicest backhanded compliments I was paid is that I'm very well known amongst the cognoscenti. I market myself very little because most of the work I do comes to me, and it'll become clear why as we get into this. So I have a relatively low public profile, perhaps compared to most of the guests that you have, but there are reasons for that which will
Mhm.
emerge. Just to give you a very quick picture of where I came from, it's a funny sort of self-invention life story. I guess like a lot of people who work in this behavioural space that we look at, I've had several sections of career, and to summarise them really briefly, I left university actually as a graduate in English literature and linguistics. And then, because it was the 1980s, I went and got a proper job with an accountancy firm in one of the big four London city firms. I was the world's worst accountant, just to be clear, and I was very
Yeah.
pleased to leave that profession soon
Mhm.
afterwards. But I got a great gig with a big investor relations consultancy. I won't mention names, but you can look it up if you really want to. So worked in the US, the UK, continental Europe, IPOs, bringing companies to market. My particular thing was writing speeches for chairmen who were in trouble, uh, which
Okay.
which caught the attention of an outfit called the British Bankers Association, who again some of your listeners might vaguely remember from back in the day. I was their director of communications for 5 years in the mid to late 19. I spent a lot of time in Brussels engaging with my opposite numbers from the other major European economies. Interesting time. Again, let's not get into too much detail about what's happening there. We might pick that up later. A couple of years in the civil service with Cabinet Office looking at civil emergencies and contingencies. We just had a major pandemic amongst the beef herd and all that stuff to do with. And then lastly, with the Environment Agency, looking at regulation and sort of good behaviour in that. And I was never very lucky that whilst in that second civil service role, I ran into a former colleague on the academic network, and she said, "Why are you not applying this mixture of learning to doing a piece of original research? You have a quite unusual take on things.
Mhm.
You're a language specialist. You can read a balance sheet. You've worked with high stress, first responders. You've worked with the uniformed services. You come from a military family, so there's clearly a public service ethic there. Why don't you put all that together and do something fresh?" And the more I thought about it, I thought, yeah, why not? And I just had, young kids, and luckily had enough money in the bank to take a risk on doing something different. So I wrote a master's thesis all about the what I saw as the fracture between econometric regulation and banking and the complete blind spot when it came to behavior monitoring. And I filed my master's thesis in the first week of July. And of course, that was the exact moment where the wheels fell off the banking
Mhm.
industry. And what was weird in terms of university politics is that a lot of the senior people, the professors, who've been slightly kind of raising an eyebrow because I was a classic kind of mature student, slightly
Mhm.
suspicious, what are you doing here? People who hadn't given me the time of day for 3 years suddenly wanted me to be their new best friend because I was right at ground zero for the banking. So I stayed on, did my doctorate, and naturally at that point the phone started to ring a lot. I got invited to join various regulatory advisory programs and eventually brought back into the industry to try and keep the participants ahead of what was going on. Also, because I, in other times, worked in consulting roles, advising other heavy industries which had
Mhm.
risk thesis writing years. I'd done various teaching gigs to kind of keep my hand in. So I taught risk perception to senior military people. I taught various kind of spins on civil contingencies and crowd engagement and crowd effects and these kinds of things. I kind of restless brain, I suppose, is the common thread in all this.
Yeah.
I'm actually getting a little bored of things like nudge politics and culture
Mhm.
scoring, although we probably will talk about that.
Mhm.
And I'm now looking on to the next thing as I write the third installment in the what's probably going to be a three-book series. And I'm looking for fracture lines in social belief systems.
Okay.
We might well talk later about groupthink, motivated reasoning, all
Yes.
that stuff. I
Yes.
think that's the future. And I've put a lot of effort over the last 10 years since the doctorate into helping
Mm.
the banking industry in particular to
Mm.
get its house a bit better in order.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's time to move on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So there's there's lots of there are a lot of avenues here where we can take this, but
There's a few, yeah.
yeah, there are a few. And apologies, I've got my little Jack Russell who's seemingly interested in the conversation.
Oh no, don't
But
worry. I've
yeah,
managed. I got my daughter to do the dog sitting today, so
right,
it's
right,
quiet
okay.
in here. I'm
But
very sympathetic to the dogs. That's
yeah,
fine.
right, okay. So if he interrupts, then
No, no
he might
worries.
take an interest
No, if I
in
had
something
the
he's
Labrador in here, you definitely know about that.
right, okay. But look, we this conversation kind of started with a LinkedIn post that I made about the UK's National Risk Register, and then you commented and you said, "Have you read this
Right.
book called Mission Improbable by Lee Clark?" And I hadn't read it.
Oh, the
Now I
wonderful Lee
have.
Clark. Yeah, he was a big
Hmm.
and one of probably three big influences on my PhD work, I have to say.
Okay, okay.
So
So
this idea of
yeah,
performative document writing as a
yes,
substitute for actual action.
yes, yes, and it that struck a chord. And the reason why I wrote that post as well was because it followed on from an Economist article that about the UK's National Risk Register, and I thought it was just a great little article. And it resonated with me because I feel like my risk management career is one that I've somehow steered into a corner or into a dead end because I feel like
Hmm.
the industry of risk management, as far as I know it, does this all the time. Performative document production, it's performative risk management, it's
I
performative
mean,
planning.
let's nail this down
Mm.
for you. So one, yeah,
Yes.
one of the things that the banking sector commissions me to do, obviously discreetly for reasons that will emerge, is to look at culture audit, culture scoring. Because we have now in this country a financial conduct regulator, very much
Mm-hmm.
appointed off the back of, I'm not going to say my research, but let's just say a groundswell of opinion
Mm-hmm.
around the need to be better at observing what real people on the front line are actually doing, as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
what the legal terms of their contracts say they're doing, which is kind of what was being, value at
Yes.
risk stuff. So we've moved
Yes.
from value at
Yes.
risk to what I call behavior at risk,
Mm-hmm.
which may not even be a real term, by the way, but it kind of encapsulates what I do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the big things that model has got wrong historically is looking at not just econometric indicators, which tend to be lagging and numerical and not very good at picking up on people stuff, but also fetishizing rather these, let's call them input indicators, like how much effort are we putting into this? And the teaching example I use on this is if you ask a politician what are you doing about such and such a social harm, particularly if they're in the government, they will quote a figure of what resource they're throwing at it, typically in
Mm-hmm.
dollars or sterling or
Mm-hmm.
number of people who've been appointed to deal with the problem. And that's just nonsense. And my parallel from the banking industry, very clearly, is people dealing with, let's call it conduct risk, or people behaving badly, obnoxiously, mis-selling, whatever. Everyone is now required to do conduct risk training as a compliance piece. And the single most popular indicator that the banking sector uses globally, I have to say, not just the UK, is training attendance. Now, can we just pause that for a second?
Mm-hmm.
What is the indicator called training attendance actually measuring? Let's just put it in plain Anglo-Saxon terms. It's measuring bums on seats or maybe eyeballs on screens. It is not measuring what's going on in the heads of the attendees. There are also, as you probably know, I don't know how much work you've done with banks, there's also quite a healthy grey market in people selling their attendance spaces to junior staff to fill in their forms
Mm-hmm.
for them. I'm probably not allowed to say that, but I speak as I find it. So the bums on seats are possibly not even the ones that you wanted in the first place, and there's a whole kind of corruption of the training
Mm-hmm.
internal market, let's call it. So the measurement, the thing you're measuring is often completely the wrong thing. What you want to be measuring, surely, is what happened as a result of that.
Mm-hmm.
So did their client engagement improve? Were people getting better solutions? Were people being more honest about maybe defects in products or things that needed fixing? Going back to the government minister, okay, so minister, you've got this knife crime reduction program, which you've thrown £2 billion at. What's happening with knife crime this week?
Yeah.
And by the way, they've got a a PR fix for that as well. So if the knife crime statistics are rising, it's because the reporting system has improved. If they're falling, it's because the initiative is doing its job.
Right, right. Yes.
So don't I should, by the way, preface all this that I spent the best part of 20 years on the dark arts practitioner side as a corporate apologist, defending vested
Right,
interests, which is why I
right,
know how the game is played, and
right.
why I thought it was time somebody did a proper doctoral level study
Yes.
that blew the lid off that.
So you mentioned Lee Clark and this book, Mission Improbable, and one of this is sort of one of the three of your biggest influences on your
The big
PhD work.
influences, yeah, yeah.
Wait, tell us why.
Okay, let's just pick up on the previous point that people very often in risk spaces are called upon to measure things which are quite soft objects to measure: human behavior,
Mm,
interaction, quality belief systems, all that kind of stuff. The great thing about a big document is that it's a physical object.
mm,
And so very often, and I first really encountered this not with the banks so much as actually dealing with the political interface on, regulating big business, particularly multinationals. Very often, if you were facing a big intractable, let's say, existential level risk like climate change or modern slavery issues or,
mm,
supply chain corruption, these things were highly resistant to indicators because the indicators we had, the MI we had, was not the MI we needed to really
mm.
get a grip on it. There's a whole separate, by the way, conversation we could have about ESG ratings basically being in the same place now that the
Yeah.
financial rating agencies were in 2007, just before the mortgage crisis. But hey, so indicators are subject to all kinds of,
Mm,
let's say, corrupting influences. What you want is to ask the basic question: what are we trying to achieve here? How can we measure the thing that shows that there's real achievement? There is unfortunately a massive vested interest of reporting on something which looks like the
yes.
change, but isn't actually the change. So whether it's the effort you're putting in, or the amount of stuff you've published, or the number of rules you've got in your
Mm,
new shiny conduct policy framework, so it's very tempting always to invent let's call it a false proxy indicator, and to start writing. No, the great thing about a great big doorstop reporting document is
mm-hmm.
there's a sort of, I know, I go back to Lewis Carroll on this. It's what I tell you three times is true. If you say something in a big enough
Sure.
format and often enough, people actually just start to believe it because it's an object that's out there.
Mm,
And we don't need to even discuss this. There's a whole school of politics that basically,
mm-hmm.
promulgates. I'm just going to keep on repeating this, and if it's on the record often
Mm-hmm.
enough, somehow it becomes a truth,
Mm-hmm.
even though it's not independently verified.
Mm-hmm.
So publishing a risk report. This is really the core of my PhD work, and
Mm-hmm.
as a self-sponsored PhD, clearly on a budget and with limited resources, I thought, what is the thing I have that nobody else has got? Well, I had in my speed dial the direct numbers of 50 of the top 100 chief risk officers in London banks.
Mm,
So I got interviews with them because I knew and trusted them, and they knew me from my previous work. And I interviewed them using the technique I use all the time, which is it's called sensitive topic interviewing. I know you know this kind of stuff because you had Rupert Eville on a couple of weeks
mm-hmm.
ago talking about very similar, so let's
Mm-hmm.
not recap all of that. Um, I was taught my interview skills by, as it happens, a former military interrogator because King's College, where I did my PhD, has
Mm-hmm.
a big war studies department which occupies the office right next door to political science. Make of that what you will. So when I talked to my CROs, I was saying to them, "No, come on, really, it's just me. You know me. We're men in suits
Mm-hmm.
together. We kind of know this game as it is played. We know that the game is a game with no game. It's like Fight Club. We don't talk about the game. So really, tell me when you come into work in the morning, what are your, how are you feeling about that? Let's get it down to that level.
Mm,
Tell me about a day when something went wrong. Because what I'm looking for in interviewing people is narrative, confessional, obviously, but
mm,
also agency, a sense of how do I occupy the corporate schema? Do I have any autonomy in my role, or is it basically people dumping on me from a
mm,
great height? Am I trying to make the best of it? Is it me having to conceal mistakes because mistakes are not a legitimate thing here? Failure is not allowed because we're banks, we don't fail. And so you have this curious kind of sense making. This actually brings me on to the second big book that influenced my
mm,
work, which is Stanley Cohen's States of Denial, where he talks
mm-hmm.
about parallel cognitive states in the population who are under dictatorships. So, how is it possible for
Right.
that nice Mr. Putin
Mm,
to have murdered my sister yesterday and yet I'm still going to vote for him today. You know, there's a significant number of people under a dictatorship who actually, in some curious way, believe that the dictator is the great leader, who's the person who's going to solve all their problems. Now, if you know anything about the psychology of risk, you'll understand that there's this idea of what we call fundamental attribution bias. That, you know, it's just, if we could just do that one thing or just get that one guy. So, I mean, recent example, UK politics, Liz Truss, classic fundamental attribution error. Oh, if we just elect her, we're going to have a new dawn in the economy. Look how that works out. We could talk about Trumpism in the US, and I don't know when this podcast comes out, who knows what on earth is going to be happening to Mr. Donald Trump, but clearly there's a significant number of people for whom Trump is just a simple kind of hook to hang all of their anxieties on, and he's going to fix it. Again, you can look at history, so you hear people casually using phrases like Winston Churchill won the Second World War. Well, he had a bit of help, you know. So it's that tendency we all have to approximate and conflate and find the easiest version that explains so that we don't have to think about it. So in the case of my CROs, what they were given was the nominal responsibility of public reporting on what they call capital adequacy. So how much money does the bank have to have, as it were, in its own account in order to cover its market liabilities? So it's like an internal insurance policy, if you like. That's kind of oversimplification, but, you know, how much cash does the bank have to have, if you, in very simple terms, have to have in its own vault in order that if there's a bit of a bank run beginning, if all the customers want their money back, you know, it can start to cover its liabilities such that public confidence will be maintained. Now, if you think about that for just a minute, of course, that's not what the board wants to do at all. They don't want their cash tied up in the vault doing nothing. They want to, as it were, unlock the vault door, take all the bullion out and shove it out in the markets to make more money. So the role of the chief risk officer very basically is, the public framing of the role is, it's like the policeman who makes sure that the bank doesn't take excessive risk with its own capital. The internal role is the complete opposite of that. It's that the board is constantly pressuring the CRO to underreport and frankly misrepresent the capital adequacy ratio, the thing that they use internally to calculate how much cash they need to keep by. Now, the fact that I was interviewing these people who were almost all men, almost all Caucasian and of a certain age, and, you know, had been qualified as lawyers, accountants, or whatever. So there was kind of lack of cultural diversity in the role already. There was also a lack of agreement as to how the role was even defined. So the CRO was a relatively new function back then. Nobody quite knew actually what a standard issue CRO looked like or what was included in the role. And boards of executives, you know, on boards were actually quite aggressively gaming this and saying to the CRO, look, if you're going to engage with us, if you want the job, actually, you need to understand that this is what you're required to do. Now, what typically happened is that between 2 weeks and maybe 6 months after being appointed, the CRO realized that they did not have authority, autonomy, agency, whatever you want to call it. And that actually it was a game of no game, that they had to conceal in their public reporting the private mandate that they'd been given by the board. And what fascinated me was, okay, so knowing that, what do you do about that? And this is where the Stan Cohen thing comes in. So the clear, you know, you and I might say as ethical specialists, if you want to call us that, well, of course you'd want to put a hand up and challenge that as being just a completely unethical contract. It's a contract with the devil. That actually took a lot of cojones, you know, and actually only 2 of the 50 CROs that I interviewed did that, and they both lost their jobs immediately, interestingly. And by the way, when I went back and interviewed the same cohort again 3 years later, they had all lost their jobs, but we'd had a financial crisis in the meantime, so hey.
Yes.
The only other 2 exit routes were, one is what I'd call, with a nod to my friends in the Japanese banks who I work with a lot, what the Japanese call rather wonderfully the window men. So you take the contract, you sit by the window, you don't disturb anyone, and provided you don't do anything embarrassing and your employer doesn't do anything to embarrass you, it's all fine, you can draw your salary and punch your card at the end of a 3-year contract and, you know, thank you very much, goodbye. The interesting one, and why I raised this, is the middle way, which is the CROs who said, okay, I know, and you, you know, the chairman, the CEO, you know that this is a game, so we're not going to talk about that. Remember, it's Fight Club rules. What I need you to do as a condition of keeping me, if you're serious about appointing me as like a high profile, you know, here's our Mr. Risk, is I need you to sponsor me to do a big piece of research such that we can publish it and say, this is XYZ Bank's take on the future of risk assessment. And I'm going to show that to the government, the regulator, to the other banks. We're going to socialize it
Mm.
through the big trade associations. It's going to be leadership in risk thinking.
Yeah. Hmm.
But guess what? You know where I'm going with this? It doesn't actually do anything. And that's where Lee Clark comes in. So it's a big
Right.
fat doorstopper document, which everybody reads and makes appreciative noises of. And then it goes in the bottom
Hmm.
drawer and nobody does anything at all. Most importantly of all, the system doesn't change. The socializing of risks, so the little day
Hmm.
to day conversations don't change. It's business as usual. It's a fig leaf for business as
Hmm.
usual. And that essentially, that's my PhD in like 2 minutes.
Right. Yeah.
And my
Well.
conclusion was
Yeah.
very clearly in the final chapter, guys, we've got to have behavior analysis. It's the only way to cut through this crap.
Okay. Can we go there a little bit more then? Because
Sure.
you're talking about behavioral analysis. I've seen your posts in your work about things like conduct risk, but what do you mean by behavioral analysis? And then is there something there for
Sure.
risk? I'm thinking more
Let's
risk
let's
functions, not
let's just
just sure, sure,
contextualize this.
sure, sure.
Yeah, yeah.
No, go ahead.
Totally. I mean, look, my window on this is 20 years back from now, if you like. So
Yeah.
maybe 2023,
Yes.
2003.
Yes.
The role of when I was just kind of starting on my PhD track, if you like,
Yes.
the role of chief risk officer was quite a new thing. There was kind of a
Mm-hmm.
sense that the banks had screwed up once in the 90s and that they were
Mm-hmm.
at that stage engaging in what we call GSVR, so government sponsored voluntary regulation, otherwise known in plain language as codes of practice.
Mm.
And the thing about codes of, have you ever seen Pirates of the Caribbean? You know, the thing about codes of
Yeah.
practice is it kind of depends on the response of the
Yeah.
participants, whether anyone takes it seriously or actually does anything
Yes.
at all.
Yes.
But they are a classic industry maneuver to hand off government intervention for maybe a few more years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of my gigs at the BBA back in the 90s was as the first editor of the Banking Code of Practice. And it was a really clear, it's actually fascinating looking back now. The banks that didn't want to participate in that then, who kicked the hardest against it, among those were two of the banks who conspicuously failed in 2008.
Mm.
So it maybe is true that there's a kind of culture of disengagement, of rule gaming, of playing the
Mm.
system that is evident from even from that level.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Sorry,
What
where
I
are we
was
going with
no
this?
what I
Oh,
was
behavior
thinking,
analysis. Yeah,
yeah, behavior,
yeah,
and look, what I where I wanted to go with this a little bit more
yeah.
is
Sorry,
maybe yeah,
Ben? Can I pick
yeah,
up the thread?
sure,
Can we
sure,
just cut
please,
this like
please,
a few seconds
yep,
and
go for it,
let me
go for
let
it.
me pick up the thread. So what? Um, let's just contextualize this in terms of the 20-year, rear view mirror that we're
Mm-hmm.
now looking. When I started, when I kind of went academic side initially
Mm-hmm.
into the role of chief risk officers was still very new, but far more importantly, and to contextualize this, Daniel Kahneman's
Right.
theory was not widely known, although of course
Mm.
Kahneman and Tversky had published it. The Nudge book had not been published.
Mm-hmm.
No universities were at that stage teaching undergraduate behavioral economics. Nobody.
Mm-hmm.
And, as a part time lecturer myself, what I've seen more and more over the last, particularly 10 years, all the kids want to do behavioral economics because it's kind of
Right.
interesting. It's a fresh spin on
Mm-hmm.
what was seen as a rather tired topic. But back then, really not at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea of saying we should be applying behavioral insights and psychology to this rather arcane market, which doesn't have really a window that the public can
Mm-hmm.
see anything through, was seen as a bit kind of heretical, and even in academia, I was not taken very seriously for this because I
Mm-hmm.
was, I was an outsider. What did I know anyway? So, in a very perverse way, the advent of the banking crisis, right at the point when I was first publishing, actually did me a big favour because it said there's probably
Mm-hmm.
something in this. So the question then became, and of course, with where there is a regulator, you need to have reporting systems. Where there are reporting systems, you have to have what they call MI,
Yeah.
reporting indicators. What are robust proxy indicators for
Mm.
financial misconduct, or what the regulator is now calling non-financial misconduct? Who the hell knows even what that means? One of my American banking clients said, I thought that's actually a really good definition.
Mm.
Casually obnoxious
Yeah.
behavior
Mm-hmm.
is kind
Mm-hmm.
of the thing that we're looking for here.
Yeah.
People who don't
Mm.
care about rule breaking or,
Mm.
pissing off their customers or inappropriate language to colleagues or worse, all that kind of stuff
Yes.
is actually quite an effective early indicator of someone who's kind of not with the,
Okay.
not on the train when it comes to compliance and just generally market acceptable behavior. So my first thought was, and this was in a great morass of, okay, what the hell do we do now? We've, all the bits have fallen all over the
Mm.
floor following the mortgage crisis, the banks clearly are saying, well, we just need more econometric regulation because
Mm.
that's the tune that we know. I'm saying no. I think what we can see from this published study is that there's actually a bit
Mm-hmm.
more to look at here. And I'm quite interested in talking to Her Majesty's Treasury about how we might frame some controls
Mm-hmm.
around this. So we started talking about what are the things we can measure which indicate behavioural engagement.
Yes.
Now, fast forward to sort of now,
Yeah.
and let me just pick out a few of those and see if your listeners
Please. Mm-hmm.
recognize them. Let's start. I will very quickly, I promise quickly, just go through the conceptual bits. There are two buckets which we need. There are approaches to human interaction. So, if you like, the authenticity, the transparency,
Mm-hmm.
the human interaction. And then there are approaches to knowledge and learning, but in particular to self knowledge.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of metacognition.
Yes.
So this is how well do we know what we know, and more importantly,
Mm.
how do we know the limits of what we know and
Mm.
not to step beyond them.
Mm.
So metacognitive skill is the thing that is conspicuously missing in large parts of social media. You
Mm.
know, people will give an opinion on anything. It's also interestingly missing in large parts of academia. Anyone with a PhD or let alone a professorship often feels free
Mm.
to kind of opine on stuff that they actually know nothing at all
Right.
about. And there's a real problem with this in the US justice system. If you talk to someone like Danny Kahan at Yale, there's a problem with expert witness professors showing off in the witness box and actually exceeding the limits of their own expert knowledge.
Right.
And by one argument, I think Dan's got some figures on this, there are people trapped in the justice system, meaning incarcerated, on the say-so of some showboating professor. Now, I have a real problem with that.
Mm.
That's a
Mm.
behavioural well, let's call it what it is, misconduct. That's something that we
Mm.
should be looking at and testing much more rigorously. Not
Mm-hmm.
coincidentally, there's a bunch of behavioural scientists, I'm not going to name anyone particularly, but you know who I'm talking about,
Mm-hmm.
whose work is currently being reviewed and in some
Mm.
cases, cancelled is the wrong word. What is
Mm.
it? Retracted
Retracted.
because of dodgy methodology.
Mm.
So let's not dwell on academia's problems. Let's look at the practicality of scoring. So in your first bucket, you've got how do we talk about human interaction? And in your second bucket, you've got what is the approach to acquisition and sharing of knowledge and learning? Now then, let me just give you a couple of strategy level headline indicators into what do we put into those two buckets. So the first one includes things like psychological safety, which I know you know all
Mm-hmm.
about, and what I call moral courage, which sounds a bit
Mm.
unfashionable, but it's in terms of behavioral psychology, it's more accurately anti-bystanding. Now, you know
Okay.
about bystander theory, you know, the bigger
Mm-hmm.
the crowd, if there's a crowd of people who are doing nothing, then that
Yeah.
crowd continues to swell, more and more people do
Mm.
nothing. Nobody wants
Mm.
to cross that effort threshold of engaging to fix the
Mm-hmm.
thing. And it's a very common state of mind in large groups of people, in
Mm-hmm.
particularly big corporations, because nobody's fixing anything. I'm not going to be the person
Yeah.
that calls it out to fix it. You know,
Or
I'm just
there's an
going to join the
assumption
crowd of
that someone else
bystanders.
is someone else
So
is doing it, or someone else's
right, you know,
responsibility somewhere.
somebody will do it. It's a
Mm.
classic. It's a classic, by the way,
Mm.
English whinge about politicians. You know
Right.
that you so typically hear in dinner parties or coffee mornings or whatever. You'll hear people say they really
Yes.
should do something about.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
it's such a kind of passive aggressive British mindset. I'm
Right.
sure you
Okay.
have, you know, across the water similar.
Mm.
They really should fix
Mm.
these, you know, floods or whatever it
Indeed.
is.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Mm.
I'm not gonna
Mm.
trade in my massive SUV to do
Mm.
anything about climate
Yeah.
change. You know,
Indeed.
so it's that sort of palming off the problem. It's the what's the word? Displacing the problem onto
Mm.
somebody
Mm.
else.
Mm-hmm.
So I think moral courage, I think, is a really interesting concept. It's a Victorian concept. You can
Okay.
just tell from the
Mm.
language, but it's something that's kind of gone AWOL. It's gone missing
Yeah.
in modern
Mm-hmm.
society as everything is kind
Mm-hmm.
of socialized and you know chat rooms to pieces. It's actually that capacity which I learned from first responders. You know, working with blue light
Right.
respondent services. It's the thing that they do that the rest of the population doesn't. It's running towards danger. It's
Mm.
calling out the hazard. Actually, now might be a really good time to talk about risk. Let's just pause
Sure.
for a
Let's talk
second,
about.
and you might
Sure.
want to park this somewhere
Yeah.
else in the podcast, but let's just cover that.
Yes.
So, I've worked throughout my career with corporate people, but also public sector
Mm.
people. So, my dad was a submarine commander, my mother was an intelligence officer. We have a very strong
Mm.
kind of public service ethic in the family, and I do believe there are studies you can find that
Mm.
there are different brain types in terms of what floats your boat. Some people are absolutely money motivated. Good luck to them. I'm not one of those people. Other people really feel that it's getting traction on, can we be the best we can be, whether it's the human race or society or
Yeah.
your local tree planting group or whatever it is.
Sure.
And I really believe, having worked with people at senior level and right down to the front line in both of those different sectors, that there are quite
Mm.
different personality types that you observe. And by the way, that the former abuse the latter.
Right.
Again, I don't want to
Yes.
get into politics, but why are nurses paid so very little?
Right. Right.
It's because their public service ethic is being
Mm.
exploited. It's really quite simple.
Mm.
Anyway, so let's talk about risk. When I talk to those two different groups of people, if I talk to public sector people, they use the word risk synonymously with hazard, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not. Of course, if I go and talk to a group of bankers, they talk about
Mm.
risk as synonymous with market opportunity,
Mm.
which it also isn't.
Mm. Right.
Risk is to be clear, boys and girls, risk is the balance of hazard and opportunity. It's both of those things.
Mm.
Is it okay to take this chance? Whether it's climbing a tree or trading a derivative contract, is it okay to take this chance knowing what's the worst that could happen and what's possibly the upside in doing this?
Mm.
And I'm a big believer in risk taking, by the way. You can see I've got a whole Pinterest teaching resource full of risk taking behaviors, which I love collecting. And
Right.
do please send in more examples. I think taking risk is part of being alive, but clearly you don't want a base jumper as the chief executive of the bank.
Yes.
There is
Yes.
such a thing as too much risk taking in terms of the adrenaline drive.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think measured risk taking, fantastic. Thoughtful risk taking, absolutely. Occasional, a sort of adrenaline risk taking, by all means, but don't
Mm.
necessarily bring it to work. But please let's not use the word risk as a synonym for all the bad stuff, because
Mm.
that's oversimplifying it. That's flattening what's actually
Mm.
a rather important nuance to that word.
That's a very useful
Let's talk about the
explanation.
second
Yeah.
bucket. Well, I kind of,
Yeah.
as a lecturer, I've had to deal with
No.
this from all different
As
directions
as
over many
as
years,
an
and I just think
aside,
it helps to focus on that.
yeah, as an aside, I've moved away from the word risk a lot because I found a couple of things. One is that the conversations were happening at cross purposes. We're not very clear what we're talking about.
Right.
And second, it's taken that sort of
I mean,
hazard
there's a point there
connotation.
that the subculture. Absolutely, if you talk to the
Mm.
subculture of, and so I do gigs occasionally in the UK for a thing called the Institute of
Mm.
Risk Management.
Yes.
There, and I don't want to belittle their work. They do fabulous research. I've participated in their research
Mm.
groups, but their view of the world is driven by the need to codify because it's what they
Mm.
do. Whether
Mm.
commercially or public sector or whatever, they need to
Mm.
kind of tie it into a series of reporting boxes, which
Right.
then make it a commodity which you can pass around any kind of organisation. I completely get that. That's their
Mm.
mission. But why don't we also think about wider horizons? I'm very
Mm.
interested in the risk horizon of how, as human beings with little monkey brains, how do we make sense of kind of risks that nobody has
Mm.
grasped before? And that's why one of the things I'm doing right now is working with a government think tank panel on the AI regulation.
Right.
Because there's no
Right.
doubt in my mind that AI is the biggest cognitive shock in a generation, possibly even in a millennium.
Mm.
Probably you'd have to go back to something like the invention of the printing press
Mm.
for an equivalent challenge to humanity's collective knowledge.
Yes.
And how do we socialize and absorb and manage that and maybe push back against some of what it does badly?
Right.
Because AI, and again, you'll have had much more expert people than me on your show, AI amplifies biases, and this is a problem.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
It takes the weakest link of its programmers, of its trainers,
Right.
and it just massively regenerates and promulgates it, and that's really not going to be
Right.
good for we have there are good biases and bad biases. You can talk about you want to talk about sort of Kahneman on the one in the one camp, and then the kind of grounded rationality camp on the other side.
Mm.
Loads of people happy to say
Mm.
biases serve us well. I'm kind of on the fence actually. There's good
Mm.
and there's bad, but what you don't want is those monkey brain short circuits then substituting for rational analysis, which is basically what
Mm.
AI is doing a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get on to the second bucket before I
Yeah.
forget the bucket. So
Yeah.
in the approach, and actually that's kind of related to this thing about rational analysis, and dual system brain theory, Kahneman stuff. Are we
Yeah.
thinking with our gut or with our
Mm-hmm.
with our frontal
Mm-hmm.
cortex? In your second bucket, you need some really pointy analyses of how do we think and how do we know what we know and how do we challenge what we know and how do we accept that there is a thing called unknown unknowns, the limit of
Mm.
knowledge and the limit of possible knowledge, the limit of
Mm.
practical knowledge? What's the difference between those two things? How do we find that out? You know, it's perfectly possible to say there are unknown unknowns. I have literally no idea how the universe works. I'm not an
Mm.
astrophysicist. That's going to remain an unknown unknown for me. I just don't have the headspace to compute that stuff. Equally, as somebody who's worked in physical risk, I know when I'm delivering a lecture that there's just the outside chance that the building might collapse one day.
Mm.
I don't let that occupy my brain. It's a kind of a known unknown, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not
Mm-hmm.
sufficient of a civil engineer to exercise a lot of
Mm.
brain power on that problem because I know that somebody else has done it. And clearly, the known knowns we should be across. That's the business of risk management, but also identifying the boundaries so that we can pull uncertainties into risk,
Mm-hmm.
into a manageable space. And that's fine. How do we
Mm.
do that? Well, not enough effort is expended on this cognitive calculation. So I think three big
Right.
things I look for. Reflexivity,
Mm-hmm.
which is not the same as agility. Agility is responsiveness in a rather conventional kind of McKinsey
Okay.
sense. Reflexivity is a bit more than that. It's the ability to stay on the front foot when there is rapid and often how should we say, undiagnosed change going on. So the
Mm-hmm.
best analogy I can think of for reflexivity is like the sports person who, rather than waiting to catch the ball,
Right.
they look and they anticipate where's the ball going to fall. It's that thing.
Right.
So
Mm-hmm.
reflexivity is the capacity that was completely missing in, for example, Kodak when digital photography came along,
Mm-hmm.
Nokia when smartphones came along. You know, these were big
Mm-hmm.
players who were at the top of the game of what they did, but they missed that there was a paradigm shift, and that was, they were sunk.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So reflexivity is it's that soft intelligence thing of, well, maybe if there were a different way of doing this, how might people be doing it, and should we be doing that?
Mm.
It's that kind of thinking. Closely linked to that is this idea of cognitive diversity. Now, I spend a lot of time going around after diversity coaches,
Mm.
and there are some particularly awful diversity diagnostic tools out there. I'm not going to single out anyone because I don't want
Mm.
anyone to sue me. But some of them, by the way, marketed by quite big brands and
Mm.
academia supported and all the rest of it.
Mm.
I'm not going to gainsay the diversity game. Let people do their thing, and that it's absolutely essential that we promote diversity. It's good for governance. It's good for better risk taking. What I look at though is this sense of mental experience diversity.
Yes.
So it's no good if you've got a board of maybe 10 directors, there's two
Mm-hmm.
middle-aged white guys, there's, somebody of Asian extraction, somebody of African extraction, there's two women, two people
Mm-hmm.
who are gender diverse or whatever. Fantastic. But then if you actually scratch the surface, you find they all went to Oxford together and read
Mm-hmm.
PPE, politics and
Mm-hmm.
economics,
Mm-hmm.
which incidentally is what a lot of our politicians over here seem
Mm-hmm.
to do. This is not a diverse group. They've all come through the same
Yes.
knowledge channel and the same
Yes.
cultural channel to get there.
Mm.
So let's not fool ourselves that surface diversity, box ticking diversity is actually
Yeah.
doing the job.
Yeah.
So cognitive diversity, and my favorite, again, people often sort of say, can you point me to an example of cognitive diversity? Absolutely.
Mm.
There's a British Channel 4 television show called Taskmaster,
Mm.
which I don't know if it's syndicated in other places, where a kind of games master sets normally a group of comedians tasks to do where the solution to the task is completely unclear, kind of opaque. And what's interesting is that these people bring many different experiences, and there's a wonderful mix of all of the things I've talked about in terms of education,
Mm.
gender, cultural origin. And what's fascinating is that people make sense of the task in completely different ways, and they get to the end of it,
Mm.
and as it were, report the result based on a totally
Mm.
different angle of approach. So, again, anyone listening, if you want a nice, easy, actually comedy format, access
Right.
to what we mean by cognitive diversity, have a look at that show. It's great.
Mm-hmm.
The final one is intellectual humility. And
Mm-hmm.
again, let's just translate that out of academic jargon into plain words of one syllable. It's the
Mm.
ability to say, I don't know. And one of the tests I do when I first go into a big organization is just I walk the corridors and strike up
Mm.
conversations with random people. And I say, after we've kind of got friendly and broken down the barriers a bit,
Yes.
tell me, when was the last time anyone used the phrase, I don't know? In your
Mm.
here, and the number of people say, God, that's a great question. Actually, never. I mean,
Yes.
I will read you this quote. I interviewed a head of asset management in one of the big London firms just last week. I want to find this quote because I want to get it exactly right. And he said to me, the idea of ever saying, I don't know, is alien to anyone who works in asset management. We're paid to know, and that's the problem.
Yes.
Now, whether you talk about overconfidence, Dunning-Kruger bias, you can kind of frame it like that. You could call it the exact opposite. So it's the sort of imposter syndrome and overcompensating,
Right.
but
Right.
it all goes to the same place. It's a simple bit,
Right.
Ben, when was the last time anyone said to you, "I don't know," on your show? I hope more
Well,
often than the
quite often actually.
population average.
Yes,
Yeah, good.
quite often
Because
I go after
you
those
interview
people.
those kinds of people. Right.
And it's a
And
sort
you,
of
of course, as an interviewer, will say, "I don't know a lot," because you're wanting to draw them out, which is as it should be.
yes,
But it's a
and
measure of curiosity. It's not just the curiosity itself, it's also, is it socially acceptable to be curious here? Is it okay in this organization to say, "I don't know"? I don't mean, I'm not saying I don't know in a kind of chaotic, oh, I don't know, not in a kind of shrugging shoulders way,
yes,
but in a,
yes,
I don't know, but we should look at that kind of I don't know.
yes, and it's there's something like I don't know what the right word for it would be, but a healthy not knowing is, as you say, that it encapsulates courage, curiosity, maybe a little bit of courage too, because it does require courage. Maybe that's moral courage.
I mean, I think it's more than that. It's actually,
Yeah.
and again, using my narrative research posh hat again for a minute, it's what I call a legitimizer. So it's a tell, it's an indicator that says actually the substructure of this conversation is by a senior person particularly saying, "I don't know." What they're doing is legitimizing, saying people who work here,
Yes.
it's okay to say I don't know stuff as long as you have then the curiosity to do something with that. It also gives a much stronger strategic signal that people who work here are actively curious. They like to learn.
Yes.
We don't just our mindset is not just sitting around here waiting for stuff to happen. And that, as you can tell straight away, pipes back into reflexivity, this idea of staying on the front foot,
Yes. Yes.
being
Have you
actively
ever
curious. As a senior
yeah.
person who I work with the military intelligence, has this great phrase: "You've got to forage for the truth," particularly in this age of internet, social media, Twitter storms, and all the rest of it. When there are so many alternative truths, so many opinions masquerading as facts. I love that in Sweden and Finland, who not coincidentally are next door to Russia, they teach critical thinking skills, right the way through the school curriculum. Because for them, the proximity of troll farms just across their northern border is a very real social hazard. And every kid who leaves a Swedish or Finnish school has, to advanced level standard, study critical thinking. Because this is our weapon against the worst of what social media can throw at us. Why?
And
I
it's
mean,
so
you know the military intelligence
lacking, isn't
test. Why is this person
it? Yeah.
saying this thing to me through this channel at this time? If you can answer those 5 questions, if the answers to any one or more of those 5 questions is questionable, you need to look again. How many people using social media even know that test? Nobody.
No. No.
So these are all tests of cognitive reach, cognitive capacity, authenticity of presented truth, whatever you want to call it. You can use all that fancy kind of language, or you can just call it the "I don't know" test. I always
Yes.
prefer to use a simple kind of Anglo-Saxon phrase, if possible,
Yes.
because that's
Yes.
what stays with people.
Have you ever come across a book called Future Babble by Dan
I
Gardner?
have to confess, I've
Okay.
seen it on the shelf. It's
Oh,
not one of the ones I've
right.
got
Okay.
through. If that's a
Okay. Well,
recommendation, I'll certainly look at it. Sure.
yeah, it's a good book. He's a journalist, but effectively saying the same kind of thing. It's one of the arguments is that Future Babble is all
Oh,
this stuff about
can I just say,
prediction.
Ben,
Yeah.
nothing I'm saying is radically new. What I do is synthesize. I look at all the stuff that's published out there, and my role at
Yeah.
industry level,
Yeah.
such as it
Yeah.
is to translate this into plain terms that the average frontline staff can engage with.
Absolutely.
And I
Yeah.
love doing that. I'm a big George Orwell fan in terms of keep the English language as accessible, as simple as possible.
Yes.
By the way, talking for conversational tells, which we might get onto, when I'm listening to the way people frame their thinking and when they tell me the stories, you can do a deeper semantic analysis of how they frame their thinking. And
Right.
that just tells you an enormous amount about their sense of agency and engagement and all that other stuff. So we might come on to that as well.
Yeah, there's so many wonderful areas we can get into. It was just I was just commenting on the something that resonated so this one of the ideas in this book is that the future babble is all this. It's about prediction. So predictions are seductive, and they sell. So when someone says these are the top 10 things to watch out for,
I have to
in the
confess to
next year.
making predictions a lot. Yeah.
Well,
The great thing about predictions is if you're right, If you're right, everybody
Yeah,
thinks you're a
you look
genius. If you're wrong, everyone forgets anyway.
yes,
So,
yeah. But I think there's value in making predictions because it's that thought
oh,
process
for
and thinking
sure.
about what the assumptions.
Well,
But it's
Ben,
it's not.
let me
Yeah,
make a prediction on your show right
sure,
now. Within the
sure.
next 2 years, there will be a major crisis of public
Hmm.
anxiety, a major crisis of public trust, which will be directly AI derived.
Hmm.
I say that with absolute certainty. You can have me on your
Hmm.
show again in October 2026,
Hmm.
and we'll look back over that crisis and discuss it.
Yes, that sounds that. Well, let's put that in the. Let's get our diaries out around.
One of my other nerdy interests is
Yeah.
patterns of historic disasters. So I tend to look back over
Right.
kind of
Right.
300
Yeah.
years and look for
Yeah.
repetitive cycles of
Yes.
misbehavior, misunderstanding, or misframing of controls, which then
Okay.
generate, disasters are often quite banal, but then they
Yes.
reveal deeper, underlying
Yes.
failures to
Yes.
grasp the risk.
So okay. So anyway, I think there's a lot there about the just having some intellectual humility and the limits to knowledge, and these are all behaviors we
Totally.
just tend not to see in leaders because well maybe you could talk a little bit about why that's the case, but
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I'm not going to name names again for obvious reasons and
yeah.
also NDAs.
Hmm.
But over the last 20 years of doing this, I've dealt with many hundreds. I've actually lost count, probably over 1,000 clients on this. There's a handful of leaders, no more than maybe 10 individuals, who I would, walk over burning coals for because they were so inspirational, the sharpest intellect, the greatest inspiration, the greatest, not coincidentally, the greatest intellectual humility.
Hmm.
That capacity to say, now, this is often a game played by senior people as well, just to be clear. So I've been into board meetings where the chairperson has said, "Oh, I don't know. Can you explain this to me?" And it's perfectly clear that what they're doing is just a test of your expertise. So let's just set that one aside. The chief exec, particularly, so the hands-on, head of the business, who says, "Actually, I don't know. We should really look at this. You're right. There's a blind spot. We should check that." The capacity to say that at the top level is incredibly rare, actually, and to kind of admit it. Now, admittedly, a lot of the work that I do is in this kind of very, very close confessional space where people will say to me, often as they start their answer, I want you to understand, I've never told anyone this. I'm just telling it to you,
Hmm.
because we're working in this very close confidential place. A lot of other people will say, oh, yeah, everybody knows this is a problem, but nobody talks about it, which is another framing,
Hmm.
similar kind of thing. So good leaders, what makes a good leader? Kind of top of the list, actually, intellectual humility. So it's the capacity to say, look, I know I've been hired because I'm good at all these things, but there are, the best leader will draw on and delegate to the best technicians. Big problem we have in the banking sector is that the people who get promoted tends to be the best, let's call them the most proficient deliverers of the technical thing. So the person that did the most volume of trades in such and such a market, or the person who managed to crack the econometric analysis, which got us that oh so fine margin of advantage in risk taking, or whatever it is. So again, I don't want to insult the entire profession, but I think of it rather as the actuarial tendency. The people
Sure.
who've got that kind of fine instinct for the
Hmm.
numbers tend to get promoted, which is great and good luck to them. And it's very good for in one way of managing a business, but it's not managing people. And why I have concerns around the increasing adoption of AI, for example, as a sort of tool of leadership is it's where if you're not already getting the best out of the people that you're managing, why are you substituting machines for people in the first place? Have you even thought about that?
Hmm.
The average group of people in a meeting room is using, I don't know, 10% of their brain capacity. And what's disturbing is that actually fully 50% of the thought capacity they could be bringing to the meeting they've kind of hung up on the coat peg at the door because it's about ethics, feelings, personal experiences of things. That's precisely the stuff that organizations should be tapping into more of, particularly in this post-millennial era when people are far more attuned to the personal ethics of doing the right thing. And there's no longer this covert or even overt contract that is an employer with a big wallet,
Hmm.
just take the money and shut up and you're now my bitch. We're
Hmm.
not okay with that anymore. And
Hmm.
I think the difference between those of us who grew up in the last quarter of the last century and the kids, my children's ages, sort of 20 something now in the first quarter of this century, is it's much clearer to that generation that it's not okay to sort of leave your ethics at the door. It
Hmm.
never was. And I think those corporates who are still playing the game of like, just shut up and take the money
Yeah.
have really, really missed a fundamental change in society.
And the ability to recruit, retain, bring in that cognitive diversity that you mentioned
Right, the ability to enthuse people. Again, I can't remember. It's been attributed to lots of people, so
mm-hmm.
it could be Churchill or whoever. But like that diplomatic skill of making people want to do something because they feel they want to do it rather than because you told them
Mm-hmm.
to.
Mm-hmm.
Again, if you want to go psychological about it, it's intrinsic motivation. It's very much a tool that I use in workshops, by the way. So
Mm-hmm.
I will give people some kind of raw material from the research that I've done in these little covert one-to-ones, and I'll give them a series of propositions to look at, and I'll say, look, this is not material that I am giving to you, as in me, Roger Miles, telling you you need to read this. This is actually material that's gathered from around the organisation doing a culture assessment, and we can talk about what that means another time. I want you to look at this material and just intuitively react to, yeah, am I on board with that? Is that me? Is
Mm-hmm.
that kind of what I was thinking about but not speaking about? And then we play a little game of kind of taking those elements and engaging in little safe space conversations. And what happens in the room is, and I use a very crude actually proxy indicator, which is a decibel meter. How loud is the level of conversation in the room? And absolutely reliably, every time I've done this, over hundreds of iterations, the volume in the room kind of rises, then it falls off a bit as people get to grips with what they're doing, and then it goes up. Normally it doubles and then doubles again over the course of the 5 minutes that we run the exercise. And what
Yeah.
that shows, and I then pause the conversation and say, you have just proved to yourselves that you ought to engage with this. I
Mm-hmm.
gave you, okay, it was a very simple task to do. It wasn't really a task, it was just a reflective moment. And again, I know you've had guests on who talk about, safe spaces followed by engagement and reflection. It's basically that. All I've done is switch back on that little bit of their brains that they used to, as I say, leave outside the office as they came into work. And they realized, you know what, we actually did want to do this. And whether they articulate it in that rational way or it's just a kind of gut feeling of, oh, this is good, let's do this. It
Mm-hmm.
just switches back on the thing that was missing. As a piece of work, I love running these programs because there's always that moment in the room when the lights, you can see all the lights coming on in their
Mm-hmm.
brains. Yeah, this is all right. We can do this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's actually taking it to be again more specific. It's taking it out of the compliance space and putting it into the, let's call it business as usual. What are we doing here? Space. And the fact that I get them across the bridge into that space using plain language and no
Mm-hmm.
scientific terms or legal threats or anything like that, to me, that was always the challenge. You've got this monster kind of dinosaur industry which needs to kind of get a bit of a brain upgrade, or at least let's call it emotional intelligence upgrade.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way to do it is to kind of lay a little trail of crumbs. People want to engage with already. They just didn't realize the extent to which they disengaged.
Right.
All I'm doing
Right.
is reawakening that sense of engagement which they originally had and lost somewhere along the way.
Mm-hmm. You were
Does that even make sense? I'm sorry, I'm summarizing. This
no,
is a
no.
very
This
short summary of
this
an
is
awful lot of research work.
yeah. This is fine. It's ambitious to do. It's already ambitious. It's hard to bring all of this into a single just single conversation. So I think this is all very very useful stuff. You were talking a little
I
bit
mean,
about well
at the risk of plugging the book, on
yes yes
the wall behind me is the vanity
yes
wall of all the stuff I've published over the last
yes
5 years.
yes
And the cupboard behind it is all the stuff I've published over the previous 25 years. So
right
there's a lot out there if you're interested.
yes
As I say, I
yes
don't market, I just kind of publish stuff and encourage people to have a
yeah
look. So what I'm
but
talking about specifically
mhm,
here is in the Culture Audit book.
mhm,
So two things happened to me in lockdown. I managed to avoid COVID, but I also broke my leg in a rather complex medical way, which involved a
oh
lot of surgery and being stuck in a wheelchair. So I thought, what better time than to write a book?
write a book
I mean, I was still working and teaching by Zoom, but actually it was
right
very much kind of paused to reflect on mortality.
right
And I thought,
right
who are the 10 people who I'd most like to work with on a book? So I approached them, and almost all of them
hmm,
said yes. So
fantastic
I've got some fantastic co-authors who I got together basically, and we know some of the same people. Christian Hunt is the
yes
obvious one who springs to mind.
hmm hmm
Christian and I had found ourselves sharing bankers conference platforms over
hmm
many
hmm
years, and we always had a good sort of sparring partner relationship. And I just thought I'd love to
hmm
write something with
hmm
Christian because why wouldn't you?
yeah fantastic
Um,
yeah
so, and I'm so pleased to say people like Stephen Scott, Maria Rajmakers, some very big hitting names from this space came in, as
Yes.
well as some lesser known but really, really interesting people names. I don't know how many people would know the name Elizabeth Arzadin, for example, but Elizabeth is wonderful. She's an Aussie who wrote the prototype culture audit manual for the Australian banking system.
Okay.
And she, like me, is a massive fan of Maria Rajmakers, who did that for the Dutch banking system, way back before anybody else was talking about this stuff in the early 2010s. The Dutch, by the way, have got a 30-year history of this. They've been doing it far longer than anybody else, applying
Really?
social psychology to rule framing. By a weird coincidence, I was at a gig at Erasmus University in Rotterdam in 1993, where they launched the original prototype called the Tafel van Elf, the table of 11 determinants of compliance propensity, or
Okay.
in non-academic language,
Okay.
if my dog shits on the grass, how likely am I to care about that? In the park.
Right. Right.
And being the Dutch, that's the actual example they used.
Right. Okay.
So,
Yeah.
am I worried about, is the park keeper watching? Is my neighbour going to shot me? What's the worst consequence? I might step in the dog shit. All that kind of
Yeah.
very basic
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah.
they were then framing into a regulatory framework that said, I think I might even have it on the wall here. No, I haven't at the moment. What they're basically saying is there are, at that stage, 11 factors which it's a Pareto analysis, so it's kind of 80%
Yeah.
certainty, will tell you whether a given population, whether it's bankers or just like the general population, will go along with a proposed piece of legislation.
Yeah.
And if the 80% is saying stuff that I'm not going to do it,
Yeah.
why are you even legislating?
Yeah. To build on that a
Again,
little
it's that
bit.
point that Christian makes about
Yeah.
if if 1% of the population not complying, you've got a compliance problem. If 100% of the
Yes.
population not complying, you've got a control design problem. And that's very
Yes.
much my space. I'm always looking at the control design, saying, why are these incredibly clunky pieces of control being designed if nobody's going to engage with them?
Hmm.
Make it easier.
To build on that a
Preferably
little bit.
use plain language as you're doing it. So I bring language
Yeah.
skills to that. Other people bring the maths.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if there's someone who's listening to this and just thinking about their own organization and just wondering because
Yeah,
culture audit sounds like a big involved
it does
thing.
sound a bit absurd. To
I've
be
got to
fair,
bring the auditors.
my publisher was very
Yeah.
keen on that title.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
my publisher sells a
Um,
lot of books to accountants, and
yeah.
the
Sure. Sure.
audit was like the red button word to get the
Yeah.
accountants to read it.
And I'm just thinking about people who
I'm
are
happy to
saying, well, I
say,
can. Yeah.
by the way, the book has been reviewed by the. Sorry, second.
No, I was just thinking.
I'm
So,
happy to say that the book has been reviewed by the regulators in 5 jurisdictions, all of whom have given it the thumbs up explicitly. So it's kind of doing a good job.
yeah, fantastic. What I was though thinking was just if one of my listeners who's thinking maybe I don't want to do a whole big bloody audit, but I do want to do maybe a little. I want to
Sure.
check in, do like a health check of our culture, and I'm concerned about maybe this one area or maybe this one team or what
Well,
are
okay.
some
At
ideas that
the risk of
yeah
offending, yeah. Let's. I'll
yeah
tell you. Let's
yeah
do some simple little tests. I mean, why don't I just play
hmm.
this as a game with you for a couple of minutes, and you'll see.
Okay
I mean, at the risk of slightly offending my editor, the publisher, the audit word is really a kind of business proxy for what you or I might call assessment or
sure
judging,
sure
having a look at. The only thing I took away from my very unhappy experience as a real, isn't it fascinating to be again as a legitimizer? You're given a license to wander around
yes
other people's workspaces, asking
right
questions. Isn't that fantastic?
right yes
What a
yes yeah
privilege!
yes yeah it
And
is
in a way,
um
that's what I'm still doing, but I'm doing it
yeah
in a rather more rarefied space, which is
yeah
sitting with the
yeah
board or, taking the
yeah
leadership team off for a little one-to-one conversations one at a time, whilst I sort of probe them for their darkest fears. I mean, it's
yes
fantastic fun. I shouldn't say that.
yes
I'm still
yeah
surprised that people pay me to do it sometimes. Anyway, so let's do some. And again, if I'm workshopping this, particularly with frontline
mm,
staff, so people who have no sense of the governance or the strategic level, maybe they've encountered a thing called the values set. And for some weird reason, all banks seem to have 5 values. Some of them even put them in literally tablets of stone in the
yes
reception area.
yeah
Some of
yeah
them use
yeah
screensavers or wall
hmm
posters or whatever.
hmm
Now, my friend, the Singapore regulator, has a wonderful test for this. They walk up to the desk of a random frontline person and they say, "Can you just remind me of one of those values that you did on your induction day?" And
mm,
the member of staff at that point says, "But that was 5 years ago. Well, how do you expect me to?" Or they'll
yeah
try and cheat and look at the mouse mat or the screensaver.
Yeah, yeah,
At
yeah,
which point the regulator says, well, just assume, think if you can remember one of those values, give me an example of a piece of work that you're doing today. Maybe show me something that's on your
yeah.
screen right now that is putting that value into practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's a brilliant test. It's so simple. There's no jargon, unless you think the word values is jargon, which I happen not to, because we all have cancer. You
Mm-hmm.
know, why do you need to learn values? By the way, is another thing. Assuming most of
Mm-hmm.
us are lucky enough to have had a reasonable childhood upbringing and to have survived into a functional social adulthood. Why do we need the compliance department to tell us what good behaviour looks like? And what an
Yeah.
incredibly arrogant thing for the
Mm.
compliance officer to do. And
Yes.
that, by the way, is where people start to disconnect. When the compliance people start saying, let me explain about good behaviour. I'm sorry, sod you to tell me about
Mm-hmm.
good behaviour. I think I know.
Mm-hmm.
And also, can I not be the judge of my own ethics, please? Can you not interpolate in that? I can
Mm-hmm.
appreciate there's reputational risk, there's ethical stuff, there's law, there's,
Mm-hmm.
FCPA controls, there are specific situations we need to avoid, and. But essentially, just do the right thing. You know what the right thing is to do. The problem begins when you get little kind of codified subculture groups who find ways to bend the rules and then do the wrong thing because it's profitable.
Yes.
Um, the other thing that compliance people do all the time, which gets it wrong, is framing all of this in defensive terms.
Mm-hmm.
So I never ever use in my work the phrase 3 lines of defense.
Yeah,
Why?
I can't.
Because as a language
Yeah.
analyst, using the word
Mm.
defense triggers you to be defensive.
Mm. Mm.
Why would I use a triggering word that sets people off on the wrong train of thought? It's nonsense. Why not
It's
let's celebrate the
yeah.
exemplary conduct, doing the right thing, helping the customer,
Yes.
however you want to
Yes.
frame it. By the way, that's all just plain language there. There's nothing legalese about that. Right, you
Do you
asked me to give
actually
you some
know?
examples.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. I was also
No,
gonna
no, no, sure, no.
ask you where if by chance knew where the term 3 lines of defense comes from, because I have no idea and everyone uses it like it's
Oh,
dogma.
yeah,
And
it's accountancy. I do actually. It's one of the accountancy regulators in the UK, but also, oh, don't start me on this
it doesn't
again
matter. It
from a
does. It,
military
yeah.
family. This kind of
Yeah. It,
no.
yeah.
Well, I had a teaching gig at the UK Defence Academy for years, and what I used to
Mm-hmm.
find was we had really interesting actually groups for senior military people who are typically about to retire after their 20 years in the military and go into a civilian
Mm-hmm.
career. But we also had captains of industry coming in to learn from military
Mm.
experience. And what I learned was that if my life were on the line, I would absolutely go to a military person because they are the best problem solvers,
Mm-hmm.
comprehenders of random risks. I would
Mm-hmm.
really not go with the people in suits.
No. No.
And therefore, and I'm sorry, that's really judgmental. And come back at me, suits. I'd really love to engage in that discussion, maybe offline later. But in my humble assessment, having taught these people for getting on for a decade, there's something about the military, again, it's the public sector mindset, maybe it's the public service thing, it's the humanity thing,
Mm-hmm.
rather than constantly looking to the balance sheet.
Mm-hmm.
But it makes people much more reflective about that point I was saying about cognitive diversity, about how will people respond to the event of us doing this thing, not
Yeah.
just what will the numbers say when we push this solution at them.
Yeah. Let's go back to the
Uh,
examples bit,
yeah, how do
if
we
we
get
if
onto
we could.
that?
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah,
Actually, I thought
totally.
you gave a good one about simply ask someone about the values. I think that's actually a little test that people can do. But
I wish I'd invented that test. I actually had it from my friends at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. I think it's
right, right,
fantastic.
right.
By the way, the MAS is one of the world's leading culture regulators. There's a
Okay.
great kind of myth amongst let's call it the Anglo-Saxon tendency, that the London
Hmm.
regulator, the FCA, and the American,
Sure.
the main kind of banking culture regulator, the Fed, that they are
Are
somehow leading the charge on this. I've got to tell you, sorry guys, Singapore, Japan, the Netherlands, even to an extent Australia, way ahead of the game.
maybe
Anyway,
one or
let's
two,
just leave
maybe
that.
one or two more
Political
little
provocation aside.
yeah, maybe one or two more little assessments
Yeah.
that people could
Yeah, so
do
I
to
haven't
sort
given
of
you any yet.
yeah.
Sure. So here's one which I'm really keen on, and actually I was teaching on just yesterday. How often, and again, just bear in mind these are, let's call them ground level, or grounded, if you want to use that term.
Mm-hmm.
Observation, right? Let's just quickly talk about observation versus surveys. So most of these firms that bring me in, because actually every firm does, staff sentiment surveys. What's the problem with staff
Mm-hmm.
sentiment surveys? Well, first of all, you're asking people who are unqualified to rationalize their own sentiment. You're asking someone to give
Mm.
essentially a psychological analysis of something which they don't really have the equipment in most cases to do, unless they have to have worked,
Mm-hmm.
have trained in psychology. Second, you're asking them to kind of post-rationalize, why do I have a sentimental feeling about my employer or my work or my product or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Third, you're ignoring the fact that most people doing a sentiment survey have a very real fear, and by the way, it's real because I've seen a lot of abuse of these things, but somehow the survey results are going to be traced back to the person filling in the form. Somebody described it to me as the hidden serial number problem, which is a very acute
Mm.
observation. Are they going to basically hold this against me when they find out that I criticise them? With some justification, I can name at least one UK bank, although I'm not going to. Which let's not do sentiment because it's. I'm not saying a complete waste of time. It's good for people feeling engaged. Blah 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 blah. If you're a real behavioural scientist, you should be much closer to the anthropology end of the spectrum and saying, let us observe what actually happens, the
Mm-hmm.
enacted behaviour, how people work in groups, what do they do when they think they're not being observed.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get down in there and do some participant observation, conversation type work, or just sit in the canteen and watch people going by and talking, or whatever it is that
Mm-hmm.
floats your boat as a observational researcher. My thing is that I have a very specific subset of observation based around conversations and storytelling, which is simply a reflection that the human animal makes sense of this continuum of risk around us by pulling it all into anecdotal form. It's why people tell each other stories, whether it's at a
Mm-hmm.
dinner party or in a work meeting, or leaning over between the cubicles in the workspace, or whatever it is. We have this need to socialize risk, and it's because actually, forget aggressive and landowning societies. If you actually, and I know you've read all this sort of Bregman and all that stuff on tribal societies, we are the greater part of the evolution of our human brains was when we were working as cooperative hunter-gatherer groups,
Mm-hmm.
not as aggressive kind of lone wolf hunter
Right.
societies,
Right.
or as
Yes.
landowning farmers and kind of dividing up the
Mm.
space. That came much later.
Mm.
The biggest evolutionary formative influence on the human brain, and there's actually a lot of anthropology now coming through this year on this, was when we had to cooperate, when we had to use the hive mind. And the expression of critical thinking was the anecdote, and whether you want to trace that back to what gossip has always been a strong human instinct, but
Mm-hmm.
so also has
Mm-hmm.
been let's call it myths,
Yes.
narrative, the big narratives about the tribal heroes and
Mm.
heroines and all of that. And it's a form of sense making, it's synthesizing sense making
Mm-hmm.
into narrative
Mm-hmm.
form. So we have this incredibly powerful instinct as a language using animal
Mm.
to formulate risk frames in narratives. Now, all of that, again, is very RC and academic, so let's just translate it into very plain terms. People make sense of the thing that just happened by telling a story about what just happened. My primary research technique is to get people to narrate a bit of stuff
Mm.
about what happened because it's a very close proxy for observing behavior. I do also observe behaviors, by the way, and occasionally I'll go in and kind of do something disruptive and see how people respond, and that's all great fun. But mostly, because I can, dress and behave and engage at a professional level using the jargon of bankers and
Mm.
lawyers and accountants, I get taken seriously quite quickly as an insider. But that's kind of my Trojan horse.
Right.
Once
Right.
I'm in, we then break it down into casual conversation. And I'll hang out in the coffee space and just randomly talk to people. Oh, hi, I'm in today to do a bit of audit, but I just, how's it going? What are you on? What are you doing? But then in these very structured interviews, I have a series of legitimizer questions, which will, as Rupert was saying the other day, you create trustworthiness, empathy, safe space, and then you kind of get
Mm-hmm.
people to reflect on, okay, so
Mm.
storytelling is great, and one of my favourites is tell me about a day when something went wrong. When
Right.
you could, there's probably been a time at some point recently when you came into work expecting to kind of launch the big thing. Ben, I could do this to you. So you've got a
Mm.
podcast which you're
Mm.
no doubt is hitting its deadlines most of the time, except when
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't, right? So
Mm.
tell me about the time you missed the deadline and what happened.
Well, I had a couple of episodes where I lost the episode and had to re-record it. Or you
And
guys
so
have,
you re-recorded it.
yeah, you record. But it is
And what kind of
it's a
went through your mind when you realised you deleted it?
well, mostly it was oh shit. And now I've got to go back to the guests who kindly took their time, and I don't know
Right,
if
so
they'll
there's loss of face.
was loss of
Yeah.
face, loss of trust. Who's this guy? This sort of a thing.
Yep.
And in another time, it was my computer. It just sort of the disk got full, old computer, and so 20 minutes into a great conversation, and I was like, oh, this is all, forget this guest. Future shows.
So that's so interesting.
Times,
In the culture of the one-man organization, the culture of the one-man organization that is Ben Catania, you've immediately told me three quite important truths.
Okay.
One is that there is an emotional, there is, let's call it an affective risk dimension to this. So it's not just the commercial thing of doing what you do. There's also, you also are very conscious that you're using the public trust image you have, if you like, the career that you left behind with control risks and all the rest of it, that you've got quite a narrow point of dependency, the leverage of this podcast to build on in order to, as it were, build trust in this new space, which is not the old space with a big brand behind you. And that when you screw it up, that's actually quite a serious weight of risk that's placed on that narrow dependency. However, you have complete agency, unlike a lot of people in corporate positions. You are the master of your own destiny. So the story that you told me, albeit a very short one, was one of triumph over adversity. You got on, you did it. You also, fascinatingly, like every banker I've ever interviewed, blame systems for things going wrong.
Yeah.
But who commissions the systems?
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, I have since upgraded my IT, by the way.
So
but yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But
okay.
and it was all
That's
down to me, like
that's just
yeah.
That's just us doing now. What I can tell within what I can tell within 60 seconds of people starting to narrate the thing is
right.
Let's just do some simple kind of MI work on this. So, in terms of narrative assessment, at what point does the story begin and end? So, what's the cut in and what's the out point? What's the closing titles? How does the person? This is slightly unfair on you because you're a one-man band and it's not really talking about a whole organizational structure. But even so, we got a bit of a flavour there of what's the internal organizational structure in your head as you deal with this. In terms of big organizations, of course, what we're really looking for is this sense of agency and autonomy or lack of it.
Yeah.
And so is the story in let's do it in mythical terms. Is it fighting and slaying the monster? Or is it the slavery years when we were all, the masters were cracking the whip and we were all rowing in the galleys or whatever it is, and we had no control? Wow. Was it the years of exile? Was it standing on the shoulders of giants? Was it the night journey? Was it, I love these kind of prototype narratives because actually deep in everyone's monkey brain, that tribal animal brain is the need to make sense of risk-taking experience in this simple sort of narrative thread way. So when somebody tells me about that product launch that we had to pull at the 11th hour because nobody bothered to check the customer requirements or whatever the technical thing, and then it all unravels and actually there was like the bad actor and the good actor and then there's me trying to mediate between them and you get this fascinating sense of the social system. And what to me is striking, again back to where we came into this half an hour ago, the formal organization. So the job title is never the same as who actually does what they do. And I even see this in boardroom. What fascinates me in boardrooms of big financial firms over many, many years, it's not the people with the big titles necessarily who are setting the pace. It's very often, I sat in a board meeting once and watched as the head of sales basically squashed the finance director by saying, look, mate, I'm the rain, you're the plumbing.
Right.
I've never forgotten that.
Yeah. Right.
It was a bit of a kind of Gordon Gekko moment, but actually I knew exactly what he was saying. You've only got money in this organization through what my salespeople do. As the finance director, you're simply the guy that turns the taps on and off, with where the water goes once it's in the system. I thought that was absolutely devastating, and I've never forgotten it. And what it was somebody with actually a relatively mid to senior level authority in the boardroom, basically putting everybody else in their place. And that is a problem that you get in audit, by the way, all the time. It's this subculture of there's the business doers and then there's everybody else. The systems, the back office, the third line of defense, whatever you want to call that, all that stuff. And that's, I guess, one of the things I took away as the narrative from my audit years, very long time, 40 years ago now. I was fascinated that there was this kind of talk to the hands maneuver that a lot of business people do when it comes to being held accountable.
Yes.
And I thought, I want to question that. Why are people not questioning that from a different angle entirely? Which is not your authority as the person with a job title or X amount of revenue, but actually you're just behaving like an asshole, and somebody needs to talk to that, because if we're not talking to that, we're condoning that behaviour.
Yeah, in the that sort of formal, because I've had these roles in this so-called second line. I hate that term, by the way. I can't stand the lines of defense.
I never
But
use that.
but I've had roles in my most recent role is one of these roles where it's sort of owning the frameworks and the things, the policies and the things that people are meant
Right.
to be doing. But it's very interesting to look at the different ways in which different parts of the organization engage,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
absolutely.
those that sort of like that
Ben, I'm
ones
really
that can,
sorry. I'm going to have to
yeah.
check on our time in about
Yes,
five
yes. We've
minutes. I
got
can
five
get back
minutes.
on
We've got
again,
some
but
fun. Why don't we wrap up? Why
you
don't
want a
we?
couple of examples?
Yeah, a couple of examples,
So I was
and
talking
then we
about
can start
observation.
to.
Just let
Yes,
me finish that
yes,
point on observation very, very quickly. So
yes.
one of the simple observation tests that you can do with frontline staff is when did you last see a senior person walk in the office and just having an
Right.
unstructured, serendipitous conversation, management by walking
Mm-hmm.
about, whatever you want to call it. I
Mm-hmm.
call it anecdote gathering. For what it's worth, Jeff Bezos, whatever you think of him, he's a big fan of anecdote gathering. He says when the data and the anecdotes disagree, I go and get more anecdotes. I think he's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely on the money with that. So observing managers engaging informally, not appraising, but just chatting, preferably
Yes.
with humility and lack of sort of self-aggrandizing their job titles. Just, oh, hi, John, how's it going this morning? That kind of
Yes.
conversation. And the other one is just cognitive diversity. Other thinking is allowed. So again, your listeners might want to just try this one. Try Googling the phrase "why did," and then put your brand into the search. Google will
Mm.
return the top 10 questions that the universe is asking about your brand right now for free.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I know Google is kind of zoned by wherever you are on the planet, so it might be a little more local. But this is basically Google saying, what are people most keen to find out about you right now? Or what
Mm-hmm.
are they most critical about? And it's just an instant diversity moment. And it's free. I can't believe it's free.
Mm-hmm.
It's such good
Mm-hmm.
insight. So I tend to say to
All
people,
good
go back to
stuff.
your
Yeah.
desk and
Mm-hmm.
try running an open search on your brand. Just see what the universe is
Mm-hmm.
asking about you. And, if all of those questions come as a surprise to you, then you're probably not thinking right.
Mm-hmm.
Might want to spend more time being reflective.
Yes. Absolutely. Look, I'm conscious of time, and we probably want to wrap up very very quickly here, or imminently. There were two or three other areas that I'd love to get your views on, but
Mm.
I don't think we have time. But perhaps we could, slot in some time in the future.
Yeah, okay. A
Yeah,
few things I'm sure we could talk about.
yeah.
For
So
what it's worth, and I don't know if you do this on your thing, but I'm really keen to kind of get people engaging with this thinking. We do all the heavy lifting, so you don't have to. This is published, so Culture Audit book here is published
Mhm.
as a piece that's designed to be accessible to general managers, middle management people, frontline staff. It's not a heavy strategy textbook.
Mhm.
We use lots
And
of plain
where
language anecdotes. We keep the language really simple.
fantastic. And where can people follow you, find your work?
You can go to the Publishers Kogan page, or you can go to Amazon, who normally offer it at 10% off. I'm
Okay.
not here to sell books. I just want people to engage in the thinking.
Yeah.
I'm not kind of primarily here to shift copies of the book.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, a lot of the people who've read it have very kindly got in touch with me to say that was fantastic. So it's always good to get that sort of feedback. Just kind of,
Fantastic.
I
I'll
didn't know a
put
subject that sounds as abstract as
yeah.
that could be as relevant and useful and practical as this. So,
Yes,
but I mean, hats off to the co-authors. I had a fabulous time putting the book together. And it made me, again, at a time when I was rolling around in a wheelchair feeling miserable, it cheered me up no end to have such a
right.
fabulous panel of co-writers to work with.
It's the work. Your work is fabulous, by the way, and I'll put all those links in the show notes, and people can find you
It's
and look
kind of
you
you to
up.
say
And
so. I
yes,
feel I was teaching about knowing what we know and knowing what we don't know yesterday, and I'm reminded my favourite quote on this subject is Isaac Newton. Do you know that one about the boy on the beach? If you
no,
want a nice quote to round this out, can I leave you with that? So, Isaac
please.
Newton, one of the world's great foundational scientists, theory of gravity, theory of physical motion, all the rest of it. He said at the end of this very long and distinguished career, I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me.
Mm, fabulous.
Intellectual humility, that's the way to do it. I love that.
Hmm. Fabulous.
How many
All
of
right.
today's kind of squabbling, petty academics step back to that extent? Not enough would be my answer.
Not just academics either. Everyone seems to think they own the ocean. Um,
Right. Yeah. People. Well, one of my other favourite quotes on that is my again Dan Cahan from Yale, who says, "Never assume that somebody's right just because they're senior to you." which I think is fabulous.
It is fabulous. That is
We need
fabulous.
to talk about groupthink, but some other time.
Yeah, we need to talk about groupthink, decision making under pressure. I was intrigued by your comments about ESG and your AI prediction. So
Yeah,
perhaps we can have you back in a few weeks' time
hold that
and
thought.
cover those topics. Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely, hold that thought. Ben, fabulous.
Okay.
What fun. Great,
No.
great to
Yeah.
finally have a chance for a proper chat.
No, likewise. Thank
See
you
you
very
again.
much.